At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" He called a child, whom he put among them, and said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever becomes humble like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me." This is the word of the Lord. So there's something about Fort Smith that just drives me absolutely crazy every time I see it, and it is particular to Fort Smith. Every time I see it, it makes me angry. Do you want to know what it is? Yeah, you don't have a choice because I'm going to tell you anyway, and I can talk louder than you. It's Shorty's Tamale Truck. It drives me absolutely crazy. Do you know why? It's because of the flashing red and blue lights that they have attached to the truck to get my attention, and they park it all over town. So every time I see Shorty's Tamale Truck, the first thing I see are flashing red and blue lights, which look just like police sirens, and I think to myself, oh no, something terrible has happened. I think somebody's been in a wreck, somebody's holding up the Wild Hog liquor store on 74th Street, somebody's broken into Sodies. These are the places I see it. These are the things that I think. And I'm so conditioned now to Shorty's Tamale Truck and its flashing red and blue lights that it only takes me about a nanosecond to realize that nothing is wrong. They're just selling tamales. But still and yet, I notice it every single time, which is, of course, the goal, right? That's the purpose. But because I can be somewhat obstinate, this also means that I will never buy tamales from Shorty's Tamale Truck just on the principle of using red and blue police lights to get my attention. So why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because it's as if Shorty's Tamale Truck parked itself in this passage, because there are flashing red and blue lights right in the middle of this passage trying to get our attention. There's a little phrase in the Bible that Jesus uses every time he really wants you to focus on something. And it is these words, "Very truly I tell you." Every time you see those words, you should think Shorty's Tamale Truck flashing at me right now. Don't get angry like I do, but that's what you should think. Every time you see or hear those words, that means something really important is getting ready to be said. He says it all the time in the Gospel of Matthew. One of the best examples I can give you is from the Sermon on the Mount, right in the middle of it, when Jesus is talking about how to pray, how to give alms, and how to fast appropriately instead of doing it like the hypocrites do. And he says of the hypocrites, in every single one of those instances, he says, "Very truly I tell you, they have found their reward." He highlights it 3 times in those 3 little instances, stacks it up on top so that we know not to be showy in our spiritual disciplines. And so we find it here in the 18th chapter of Matthew. The disciples have come up to him. They've said, "Jesus, we want to know who's the greatest." A reasonable question. Whenever you get 12 men together, they want to know which one's the best. And so there they are. They go to find out from the leader himself which of them is the greatest. Now, do we imagine that they actually believed Jesus would answer this question? They must have, but still, I mean, I didn't even meet him, and I know that he wasn't going to answer that question. But still they go and they ask him this question, "Jesus, who amongst you is the greatest?" And what does he say? He says, "Very truly I tell you, you must become like children if you wish to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." And he calls a little kid over. Because that's what they did. They would segregate the kids off to the side. If you think when you grew up, it was children should be seen, not heard, you should have lived in this era. I mean, children were practically kept in a box and only released when no one else was around. So he calls over a child and he says, "Unless you become like one of these, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." So what does he mean by that? For me personally, I was hoping that he meant that you just needed to remain immature for your whole life. Sadly, I don't think that is the case. He means something different. He says to us that what he means is that we should be humble. He says, the one who is humble is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. He says we should be humble. So what does this mean? Well, people have debated what this meant. Martin Luther, he said that if we're being humble like children, that means that we should be good listeners. Now, Martin Luther had 6 kids, and still and yet somehow came to this idea. I don't know how he did it, but anyway, he thought that we should be like children and be good listeners. Not sure about that one. Other people thought that we should be like children because they are good receivers. Like you give children a gift and they're grateful for the gift almost no matter what you've given them. But again, they've never seen a child receive socks, so I'm not sure if they know what they're talking about. Did you make a comment just then? Okay. So what does it mean? What does it mean to be humble? What does it mean when Jesus says you should humble yourself like one of these children? What it seems to mean, what most people think that it means, is that children don't care about status. Children don't sit around and think which one of them is the greatest or the least. They have to learn that as they get older. It takes time in a child's life before they sit down and start to actively think if the other kids at the lunch table are cool or not, or if they start to think how high they are in the social hierarchy in school. It takes time for these things to happen. Children don't naturally grab on to the issue of status or of being better than somebody else. We teach that to them. So as they get a little older, then these things become very important to them. But very early in their lives, they don't think in these terms. And so most people think that's what Jesus was talking about, that he was talking about children not caring what their social status is, something that was incredibly important in his time. Social status was almost everything. And he's saying, don't worry about your social status. It reminds me a little bit of the kids' table. Did you ever get put at the kids' table when you were young? Did you have the kids' table? You know, it would be Thanksgiving, and the dining table would be formally set. Your mother-in-law would have made some sort of, turkey centerpiece that she would have put in the middle. Maybe your mother-in-law didn't do that. But there would be some sort of centerpiece that would look very nice. And then off to the side, preferably in another room, would be a card table. And that card table would have chairs around it, and it would have paper plates. And that was where the kids sat, right? The kids went to the other room so that the adults could sit around and talk about the very important issues of the day without being distracted. So the kids go to the other room. I remember being put at the kids' table, and I remember thinking that the kids' table was one of the best things that had ever happened to me early in my life. I thought, this is great. I don't have to worry about table manners. I don't have to listen to boring adult conversations. I really don't even have to eat my food because I can put my food onto the person next to me's plate and their parent will get mad at them for not eating. I thought that this was the greatest situation in which I had ever found myself. But then I got a little bit older and I started to think, wait a minute, I have been duped. I have been tricked. I have been sloughed off to the side when the real action is in the other room. And I thought, this just doesn't seem right to me. And so I thought about this as I was reading a story about a kids' table. So in Oklahoma City, a woman named Clara Luper got 13 kids together. 13, they weren't all hers, thank God. 13 kids, and she took them downtown in Oklahoma City for lunch. Gets them all downtown to Oklahoma City. They go into a restaurant. And you can imagine the reaction if you got seated next to 13 children, right? You wouldn't be so keen on that. You're in there, you're trying to have a nice lunch, and here comes this mob of like Genghis Khan Mongols coming in, sitting down at a table next to you, loud, speaking to each other, saying stuff that you don't want to talk about, you can't hear anymore. So they sit down in the restaurant, and everybody stops and looks at them as they kind of sit down in the restaurant. But they sit down, and the waitress comes over, and they say, "We would like 13 Cokes." Great. More sugar. 13 Cokes is their order. So they ask for that. The waitress, however, is not sure that she wants to serve them. So she doesn't really say anything. She just listens, doesn't write anything down, and walks away. So the manager comes over. And the manager says to them, 13 kids and Clara Luper, he says to them, what do you want? And they say, "We want 13 Cokes." And they get their money out and they put it on the table. And he says to them, "I don't think we're going to bring you 13 Cokes. In fact, I think you should leave." And he asks them to leave. Now, at this point, the other customers around this table of 13 kids and Clara Luper are no longer quite as patient with the kids. And they're saying to them, "Yes, you should probably leave. Yes, you don't need to be here." But the kids say, "All we wanted was 13 Cokes. We want 13 Cokes." And so they sit there. And so then the manager, finally realizing that they're not going to leave, calls the police. And so the police come. And the police walk in. And the police say to them, "You need to leave. You don't belong here." And they say, "All we wanted was 13 Cokes." And the police say, "We don't want any trouble. You need to leave." And so they say, "Okay, we'll leave. We'll just come back tomorrow." Now, this was August 19th, 1958. The 13 children were black, sitting at Katz's segregated drugstore in downtown Oklahoma City. And they were asked to leave. And they did. They came back the next day, and guess what happened the next day? Katz's desegregated their lunch counter. And so then they went to another place the next day, and another place the day after that. And over the course of a year, they managed to desegregate all of downtown Oklahoma City. And sometimes they would go to a restaurant, and they'd be like, "Great, we're so glad to see you. We desegregated yesterday." And then other restaurants they would go to, and they would be met by cursing patrons, by owners who told them that if they came in, they would be shot, all sorts of these sorts of things. Now, what I learned, and what was remarkable to me, was before this happened, Clara Luper had spent a year writing to the civic leaders, the city fathers of Oklahoma City. And Clara Luper was a devout church attender, very, very faithful woman, and she had written to these leaders asking them to desegregate their downtown. And the common ground on which she had implored them to do this, the shared worldview which she was relying on to make common cause with them, was their shared faith in Jesus. These were church-going men. It was Oklahoma City. She knew that they were. She was a church-going woman. This should be an easy decision. And yet, it was not. And it made me sad. It made me sad that those men could go to church every Sunday and sit in church every Sunday and perhaps hear this passage read to them some Sunday and not have it occur to them that what Jesus is asking us to dispense with, not just in our lives, but in the world, is this idea of the kids' table. This idea of places in our lives or in our society where some people just aren't welcome. This idea that we need some sort of other space. It is humility. It is the humility to which Christ calls us that teaches us that we are no better nor any worse than anyone else around us. It is this humility which tells us that it is not okay for us to segregate ourselves based on our superiority and another person's inferiority. And yet if you go back And if you look at the history of the world, and if you look at the history of Western civilization and the problems that have been caused and befallen within it, you will see what has happened is a failure of good church-going human beings to recognize their own humility, their own smallness in the eyes of God, their own equality to those people that are around them. Those people who may be rich or poor, male or female, Greek or Jew, slave or free, black or white. They had gotten it into their heads, just like the disciples who went to Jesus, they had gotten it into their heads that somehow they were the greatest. And as the greatest, they should have greater stuff. Jesus calls us to the exact opposite of that. Do we imagine that we will die and we will ascend into heaven and we will find that the best seats have already been taken? Do we imagine that we will go there only to find out that the rich people get to go in the really nice part of heaven, we get the middle part of heaven, but don't worry, we'll keep the poor people down in this other part of heaven? Do we imagine that it'll be like that? Do we imagine that we will get to heaven and still segregate our neighborhoods and our churches based on race? Do we imagine these things? Do we imagine that this is what the kingdom of heaven is like? No. No. There's a reason that the prophet Micah said, walk humbly with God, because if we don't have the humble in there, we start to strut because we think, hey, I'm walking with God. I must be the best. I'm really good. It is the humility that reminds us that we walk with God not out of our own greatness, but out of the greatness of God. It's the grace of Jesus Christ that will lead us into the kingdom of heaven, not our own greatness. And we think to ourselves, this is better, the society's better. It's not like it used to be. We don't have segregated lunch counters. We don't have segregated bathrooms here in Fort Smith. And we're right, it is better than it used to be. But what about our own hearts and our own minds? Do we not still and yet segregate ourselves in our own hearts and our own minds? Do we not do it based on race, based on gender, based on wealth, based on beliefs? Do we not, and this is a particular issue for me, do we not do it based on our political beliefs? Do we believe that heaven won't be equally populated with crazy liberals and evil conservatives? Do we not believe that? And yet here on earth, we feel somehow we are superior because we have the appropriate political beliefs as opposed to the inferiors over there who watch the wrong news. It is humility which gives us the ability to see that we are all sinners, we all fall short of the glory of God, and we all rely on the grace of Jesus Christ for reconciliation. It is humility which tells us it is wrong to keep people out because of how they look or how wealthy they are or what their beliefs are. It is humility that tells us that in the kingdom of God, we are equal to one another. We are brothers and sisters in Christ. It is humility that teaches us these things. And if we do not have it, it is quite possible we do not have a seat in the kingdom of heaven. Amen.